Okay, well, I've already been so well introduced. Right? You know me better than I know myself. So to that, what I would add is that I am a lay person, right? So I don't have sociology, anthropology expertise. I'm kind of just coming at this as a lay minister, lay apologist. And I also have to concede I don't know anyone who is gay. I'm not gay, I don't have gay friends, gay family members. So this is kind of something I've had to explore and sort of learn about. And like Scott said, I thought I had a contribution to make, so I volunteered and did a bunch of my learning and conferring with knowledgeable people, and then I've done my research. So I'm here to present you with my research. Now, I'm not a complete stranger to public speaking. I've taught Sunday school classes, adult Sunday school classes and such before. And as a martial artist, I have to take martial arts tests with everybody standing there watching me fall on my face and mess everything up, right? So I'm kind of used to failing spectacularly in front of a group, so I'm prepared to do that here today. No, I'm not going to fail. But I do like to bring something a little new and unusual to presentations. I like to, why see the same old same, right? So I'm going to try to do something a little new, a little maybe unusual, which is actually, I'm going to be a little critical of some of the arguments that Christians have typically used in debating the gay marriage or just the gay issue in the culture. Because I find some of our arguments have been less than persuasive, right? And of course, gay marriage is now the law of the land, right? So there is a failure to persuade our culture. So I think we need to examine that. Basic military dictum is when you lose a battle, you've got to examine what went wrong so you can do better in the next battle, right? So that's going to be some of what I do. So indulge me as I walk you through my logic. Hopefully you can learn something new, which is my goal. And of course I'm not going to be very red meat. I'm not going to be gay bashing and going crazy with that, but I suspect that that's actually not the tenor of the room anyway, so I think we'll all get along. Mark seems to be a great guy. It seems like his material and my material kind of works well together. So I think we'll get all along there. So my sort of theme is calm down, right? If there's a lot of wild passions about the gay issue, I suggest maybe kind of just calm down and be a little more even-keeled. And as we go, we'll see why. That is my point. Okay, so let's get to these arguments. Here are 6. Now, in the course of doing my research and just thinking about this, I kind of found what I would have called 11 arguments that Christians tend to commonly use. And you'll notice none of these are biblical arguments, so I'm not even really criticizing any biblical theology. I'm just saying these are things I hear Christians say that I think we can look at, and if we understood some of these issues a little better, we could kind of see that maybe saying it differently would be helpful. So here's our list of things. Number 1, marriage has always been between a man and a woman. Legalizing gay marriage would be changing thousands of years of tradition. Number 2, gay marriage harms, weakens, and undermines the institution of traditional marriage. Number 3, if we legalize gay marriage, it's a slippery slope to polygamy, incest, and/or bestiality, as we will have eliminated our justification to deny these other practices. 4, the purpose of marriage is to procreate, and same-sex couples can't have children. 5, marriage is not the creation of the state, thus the state does not have the power to redefine marriage or create new kinds of marriages. 6, civil unions are just as good as gay marriages. The term marriage should be reserved for what it really is, the union of one man and one woman. All right? So the other 5 arguments that I chose to not include in this list require what I would have considered kind of expertise in clinical fields in psychology to really address. But I feel all these can be kind of addressed with one kind of field of study, and we'll get there in just a minute. But I don't know if you agree with me or not, but some of this isn't the best. Just look at the first argument. Marriage has always been between a man and a woman. Legalizing gay marriage would be changing thousands of years of tradition. So, it's already been established we're all Christians, right? We're familiar with our Bibles. We know that plenty of guys had multiple wives in the Bible, right? So, marriage has not always been between one man and one wife, right? Therefore, there's an inadequacy in that argument. It's not comprehensive. It's not really addressing the reality of the situation. So, if you're going to say something like this first argument, you probably should be a little more informed as to what marriage has always been, right? If you're going to make a declarative statement about what marriage has always been, try to find out what marriage has always been, right? So that's really the thrust of the material I'm going to present in this first 45 minutes is, well, what has marriage been in different cultures and different times and different places? And of course, how did we arrive at our own marital customs in the modern America, the modern West? Okay. so let's see. Yeah, that gets me there. All right, so like I say, this is going to be kind of anthropological, right? If you want to know what marriage has always been, you got to do your anthropology homework, so this will be an anthropology lecture. But if you're a History Channel fan, you'll think this is awesome. If you're not a History Channel fan, stick with me because, if you see where I'm coming from, you can maybe see my points I'm trying to make. So, what types of marriage have there been in human culture? And these are kind of the main ones that I was able to find. Okay, there's what we typically call polygamy, right? But that just means more than two people. But that really breaks down into polygyny, polyandry, and polyamory, which we'll cover each in their turn. But the Cliff Notes version, polygyny is what you typically think of, a man with multiple wives. Polyandry is the opposite, a woman with multiple husbands. Polyamory is more than two women and more than two men. There have been recognized homosexual unions in world history. In some cases, formal marriages, in some cases, just recognized relationships. And of course, monogamy, right? It's what we do, it's on the list. So, diving right into that, here we have a nice Muslim family, man and his 4 wives, right? So, beginning with polygyny, just to unpack this a little bit. From your Bible, you already have an understanding that polygyny was common, albeit in antiquity, right? What the anthropologists would tell you is that when most human societies were nomadic, pastoral, following their livestock around, or when their growing of vegetables was just done with hand implements, hoes, shovels, so they basically had your garden in your backyard. Those cultures tended to have polygynous marriages, or at least a polygynous ideal within those cultures. For whatever reason, just like when we invent the computer, it radically changes our culture and our society, or the industrialization changed our culture and our society, in the same way as something as innocent as the plow was a huge technological leap. People went from wandering around chasing livestock or growing small vegetable plots to large-scale monocropping, farming, agriculture, modern agriculture. That led to sedentary civilizations, that led to urbanization, cities, which led to all sorts of other things. It really changed culture, and one of the changes in culture was you started to see the emergence of monogamy. One man, one woman. Okay, so in your Bible, you see Abraham moving around, living in tents, following his flocks. He has multiple wives. By the time you move into the later Old Testament era, the Israelite monarchy, you see less of that. By the New Testament, you really don't see it at all. Mark brought up a good point that the statement in, 1 Timothy or something about deacons should be the husband of one wife, might be a statement about polygyny, but it might not. Some people argue that could be talking about something else. But bottom line, this is something that was very widespread in antiquity, but it's been dying out. The biggest system of thought that continues this is actually Islam, which is what you're seeing here. Of all the majority Muslim states in the world, only Turkey and Tunisia have banned this practice. Every other majority Muslim country still practices polygyny. It's on the books, it's legal. Okay. There are other countries that are not majority Muslim, such as majority Hindu India, majority Buddhist Myanmar, majority Buddhist Sri Lanka. All have legal polygyny today, but it's only for their Muslim minorities. There are cultures that have nothing to do with Islam that still practice polygyny. In pre-Christian Africa, or what I should say is there's some African nations that are actually majority Christians, like Zambia, Republic of Congo. But they still practice polygyny. This is just a holdover from the pre-Christian era. This is what they were doing before. For whatever reason, that culture hasn't let go of that. And also, here in our good old US of A, we have our Mormons, right? Our fundamentalist Mormon groups. So, polygyny is not legal in the United States, but people like this can still be found every so often, and they pop up on the news. And even amongst American Muslims, they do it underground, but some will still have multiple wives. All right? So that exists, and it's actually still happening. That was my basic point. This still goes on, but it was very widespread. Now we move on to something a little more unusual. Polyandry. Polyandry comes in two forms, which are, it's done for two completely different reasons. What you're seeing here is a kind of a bas relief from India, a few centuries old. This is Queen so-and-so and her 5 husbands. Okay, and here's a photograph, so this is modern. Here's a woman with her 2 husbands and their children. Now the reason this is common in India, or in the Himalayan countries, so this is India, Tibet, Nepal, Bhutan, that area. The reason this is common there is, well, let me back up a minute. The way they are practicing polyandry is that these 2 guys are most likely actually brothers. So what they do in this culture is brothers will have one wife in common amongst them. Now the main reason they do that is because if each of these brothers married somebody different and they started their own households, when their parents died and they inherited the family land, that land would be subdivided. And then when they hand it to their kids, it's subdivided, 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 subdivided. So these people are already kind of poor subsistence farmers by their culture. And if they kept dividing their land up, they'd wind up with so little land they couldn't live on it. So the solution to that problem in this culture is that all the brothers collectively form one household. So when the parents die, that one household inherits the land. The land's not subdivided. That's why they do that. But that is a Himalayan practice, which is why you're seeing Nepalese-looking people there. Now, a completely different reason this happens in a completely different place in the world. Any World War II buffs in the room will recognize, Guadalcanal, Bougainville, Rabaul, New Britain, some carrier battles happened in this very area. Right in the middle of this all is the Trobriand Islands. The natives of the Trobriand Islands have a completely goofed up idea of where babies come from, okay? They acknowledge that there is some role that the man has in pregnancy, but they don't believe that the man's actually creating the new life in the woman. They think that the new life within the woman is created by an ancestor spirit that enters the woman. Okay? So this culture does not recognize anyone as having a father. You only have a mother. But you do need sex to get pregnant, however that works. Therefore, women will have multiple male lovers, which they formally marry, because no matter how weird your culture is, there are still boundaries that you can violate, right? Every culture still has an idea of something that is promiscuous. So women have to be formally married to these various men, but they will have multiple husbands. And what's interesting then is that none of the husbands are considered to be the father of any resulting children. The woman will still live in her parents' household with her siblings. So the woman's brothers actually function as any child's father, right? So the woman has kids, the woman's brothers actually raise the kids as theirs within that household. Because bear in mind, the brothers are doing the same thing. They're married to different women, and those kids that are actually theirs are being raised by that woman's brothers. So a man's responsibility in this culture is to raise their sister's kids.
Suppose there are no brothers.
Then it's just males in the household. But that's how they do it. It's a completely different rationale, gets them to the same place. Very bizarre, but there it is. Now this is mostly in the Pacific Islands. There are some even Native American tribes, mostly from South America, that actually do this. That gets us to one of the more bizarre ones of the bunch, which is polyamory, just basically multiple women, multiple men. Generally the way this goes is that it is actually similar to this. So just like this, these guys were brothers, polyamory tends to be the same way. It might begin as a heterosexual marriage, one man, one woman, but after a while, the guy's brother joins the marriage. Then the woman's sister joins the marriage. And then it just keeps glomming on until you have a group of sisters and a group of brothers. Or alternately, a group of brothers that have married different women will share the wives, or a group of sisters who have married different men will share the husbands. But typically, in polyandry, somebody's a group of siblings. So it's not a big surprise then that the way that tends to work out is the same culture here in India, Bhutan, Tibet, Nepal, that area, also does the polyamory thing. but also throughout Polynesia. So the same cultures that do this sort of thing also do that. It's very unusual and bizarre. Now, here's an interesting one too. This was actually done in Europe. Here's a quote from Julius Caesar's The Gallic Wars. He's talking about the Celts of England, the pagan Celts in England. And he says the following: 10 and even 12 have wives common to them, particularly brothers among brothers. So there's exactly what I was talking about. A group of brothers have wives in common. And parents even among their children. But if there be any issue by these wives, they are reputed to be the children of those by whom respectively each was first espoused when a virgin. Okay, so there's just some very bizarre marital customs from around the world. All right, so now that gets us to homosexual unions, homosexual marriages. People who want to argue that gay marriage was accepted in the past will usually point to three really gleaming, quote-unquote, gleaming examples of it. Ancient Greece, ancient China, and among the Native American tribes. So here's some nice pieces of artwork from ancient Greece showing guys looking a little bit too comfortable with each other. In ancient Greece, it was legal, there were formal, legally recognized marriages that a man could enter into with an underage boy. It was never two adult men, it was two underage boys, or a man and an underage boy. And oftentimes the man that was getting into these marriages, in fact, that's probably what you're seeing here. Here's a guy with a beard, looks a little older. Here's a guy without a beard, looks a little younger. So oftentimes the man marrying the boy is already married to a woman anyway, right? So this is just kind of like a little side liaison, but there's a formal marriage that legitimized it within that culture rather than being a fling or an affair or something secretive. In Greek culture, so this is where it gets bawdy, so plug your ears. In Greek culture, the appropriateness of one's sexual role was not to have sex with the opposite gender, right? I'm not masculine if I have sex with women, and I'm not feminine if I have sex with men. In Greek culture, the male, to fulfill the male role in sex, you simply had to be the active one, right? You had to be on top. I'll let you fill in the blanks what that means. And to be feminine, you had to be passive, right? You had to be the recipient, right, of the active member. So this man would not have been considered effeminate for having this relationship because he's assumed to be the active one. He's the penetrator, right? The boy is the recipient of the relationship, right? Now, these marriages were actually temporary. When the boy reached the age of 17, this dissolved legally. And the reason this dissolved is the only reason the boy's in this relationship and being passive is because he's not a man. When he reaches 17, he reaches that culture's view of adulthood. He's now a man. He would no longer accept the passive role. Make sense? You don't have to like it, but yeah, that's exactly right. Now you know where all the Greek jokes come from, because it was basically legal pedophilia. But that's the way it worked. For women could do the same things. Let's see there. Yeah, that's about all I wanted to say about the Greeks. In China, you had the same thing. You had legal gay marriages. So what this picture is this is a woman peeking around the corner at these two guys snuggling. Those are two guys. Yeah, exactly. You can't tell because they don't really look any different than the woman, right? But this is a culture where everybody wore these flowery outfits and makeup and did their eyebrows and such. But that's what's going on there. Oh, by the way, I was kind to you and I cropped the bottom of this up. You can see what they're doing if you were seeing the bottom of the picture. So it's a graphic picture. In China, they did not view, these guys would have been both adults. They're both choosing to do this, so this is not a pedophilia thing. What they do is they are not so much married, is that they adopt each other as brothers. So whichever one is the older one is the adoptive elder brother, and the younger one is the adoptive younger brother. And that somehow makes them a household, and they can do this stuff. But even in China, this again was a recognized legal relationship, but it was still understood to be temporary. Now, unlike in Greece, where they had a hard cutoff point, age 17, in this culture, lineage was just extremely important. Okay, so these guys knew that when they were done having all this fun, they had to still have kids, right? So these guys still would have broken up, married women, had kids for lineage purposes. So this was still considered temporary, you know, not fully recognized on par with heterosexual unions. Now, probably the most bizarre one, although the Greek situation is very bizarre, is amongst the Native Americans. Most Native American cultures, Indian tribes, do not recognize just two genders, male and female. Most recognize, well, more than that. No matter how many more they recognize, they just call it third gender, right? Just like in American politics, there might be a dozen parties beyond Democrat and Republican, but we just call them third parties, right? So, third gender. They recognize third genders. Also, they will call third gendered people two-spirited, right? Because I have a male body, but if I have a male and a female spirit, I'm going to exhibit female traits. You know, if a woman has a female and a male spirit, she'll exhibit male traits. That's the way they viewed it. So this explanation actually appears on the website. Let me take my glasses off. Indian Country Today Media Network. So I'm going to read this. In Navajo teaching, in the old traditional world, there were four basic genders. Women are the first gender, because Navajo is a matrilineal society. Men are the second gender, and the third gender is one who is born as a male person, but functions in the role of a girl in early childhood and in the role of a woman in adulthood. And it's just the opposite for the fourth gender, where they were born biologically female, but functioned in the role of a boy in early childhood and matured into a man and conducts their life in that gender identity. So there you go. Now, interestingly enough, two-spirited people were viewed almost like shamans. They had a special connection to the spirit world. So they weren't actually thought of as oddballs. They were actually referred to respectfully. They were given deference within these cultures. And another very odd thing is that two gay Native Americans wouldn't have normally formed a union or a partnership because they would have been viewed as related in the spirit realm. Therefore, that would have been an incestuous thing for them to do. But heterosexuals thought that they would receive blessings from the gods by having sex with a two-spirited person. So the gay Indian had lots of sex with heterosexuals who thought they were going to get something out of doing it. So that was another weird outlier, but nevertheless, that's the way it worked. Now, just to put this in perspective, only the Inca, Aztec, Comanche, and Iroquois did not hold to this. Everybody else held to this. Okay. Now, where does that get us to? Monogamy. Sure, monogamy is the next on the list, right? But I'll assume you know about that. It's what we do in our culture, and I only have a few minutes, so I won't spend any time talking about monogamy. But this was just the outlier stuff, right? This was my effort to first say, okay, there's been a lot of really wacky marriage or sexual practices in world history. And some of this stuff is photographs, right? I mean, these are photographs. That's a photograph of this family. So this is stuff that's happening in the modern world, okay? But native islands in the Pacific don't really mean a lot to us in the West, in modern America. So what I would say is more important is we need to know kind of how marriage developed through the Western world, particularly backing up from us, from America, but then probably to England, then to Europe, Christian Europe, to trace that through. And hopefully, I can communicate this well enough, but as we go through this, marriage in the West, putting the weird stuff aside, looking at heterosexual monogamous marriage in the West since about the Christianization of the Roman Empire. What we're going to hopefully see is there's four things that are all kind of working together, right? You have the people themselves that are getting married, the individuals in the relationship. You have a community or a culture in which those people live, right? There is a government, if present. It could be a tribal group, right? They don't have a state, but most of the time they're going to have a government. And then there's religion. What does the people's religion tell them about the world, right? The Pacific Islanders' religion told them that an ancestor spirit is what creates a baby. That led to a completely jacked up marriage system, right? So you can see how religion affects culture, it affects the way individuals behave. So hopefully what we're going to see is kind of like the evolving relationship of these things. Okay, so in terms of where did we start in Europe at the time that Rome started to become Christianized? Well, we already talked about gay marriage in Greece, and we talked about the polyamory in the English Celts. Those were the outliers, those were weird practices. The reality is that even pagan Europe had a monogamous heterosexual ideal of what marriage should be. So that's the world that Christianity started to come into. I think what's really important is that in ancient Greece, which is kind of where we would start, you know, tracing the origins of the Western world, the government had no role in regulating, defining, or having anything to do with marriage, and even the religious systems back then did not. Marriage was entirely a matter of two people deciding they wanted to get together, live together, form a family, whatever it was. All you needed to do to be married in Greece is to cohabitate. That's all you had to do. And in Rome, all you had to do to be married is cohabitate. Now they had more elaborate the Romans had more elaborate wedding laws and ceremonies and such. But all that was just kind of optional. It was stuff you could do. All you had to do is agree, yes, we want to do this, let's get on with it, you were married. So marriage only existed on the level of the two individuals getting married. There was no religious or no governmental involvement. So as Rome starts to Christianize and Christianity starts to spread around through Europe, you do see the church begin to get involved a little bit in marriage. All right, let's see. Ignatius of Antioch, writing to Polycarp of Smyrna in 10 AD, 110 AD, says, "It becomes both men and women who marry to form their union with the approval of the bishop, that their marriage may be according to God and not after their own lust." So there's a theologian talking to another one and saying, you know, hey, maybe the church should try to oversee what people are doing so people just don't get married for any crazy reason and it kind of runs off the rails. A little later on, as time moves on, we start to see a lot of other things happen. Paul's wife made a brilliant statement. She said that on your 40th birthday, God gives you bifocals. Well, I haven't got that yet, so I just got to keep taking these things. In the Middle Ages, the church began registering marriages. So if you want to be on record as having officially been married, you could register your marriage at the church. But that was not mandatory. In 1184, at the Council of Verona, the Catholic Church started to adopted sacramental theology. You know, borrowing the cue from Ephesians 5, right? Just like Christ laid down his life for the church, so the husband sacrifices for the wife, and just like the church, you know, is obedient to Christ, so the wife should be obedient to the husband. The idea that marriage, in some level, embodies the mystery of Christ in the church, led the Catholic Church to say, okay, we're going to view marriage sacramentally. We see this theologically as a sacrament. God is creating this thing through a special act of grace. And that came into being in 1184. And of course, the corollary to that is the Catholic Church's very well-known antipathy towards any form of divorce, and it came along at the same time, right? Because if God is now, through grace, creating a marriage, people can't mess up something that God's done, right? By 1215, in England and Wales, another interesting practice was introduced. The church introduced in 1215 the issuing of the wedding banns or bonds. I don't know how it's to be pronounced. It's B-A-N-N-S. And the idea of the wedding banns is this is a proclamation publicly made 3 Sundays before your wedding that you're intending to marry, right? And the idea is that this gives people who object a chance to say, hey, wait a minute, this shouldn't be happening, right? It's like, wait a minute, that's my daughter. I've never heard of this until now. She can't do that, right? So if that type of stuff is going on, that at least gives that a chance to be stopped. About a century after that, people seeking a waiver of the bans could go directly to the church authorities and get a wedding license, a marriage license. Let's see. Oh yeah, okay. Also in the medieval period, other customs emerged. Women taking the family member of the husband, or the family name of the husband, right? Mrs. Johnson, or Miss Johnson marries Mr. Smith, she becomes Mrs. Smith. The idea of people dating emerged in the medieval period. Before this, marriages were arranged, right? So in basically the pre-Reformation era, that's when you see a lot of those practices emerge. Marriage licenses, marriages taking place in churches, a ritual form of speak now or forever hold your peace. Okay, but all these were church practices that were optional. None of this had to be done. These were emerging norms within culture that the church was bringing about. But in terms of what the society really in the end would accept, right up till the Reformation, marriage was still two people just decide that they're going to be a family and they cohabitate, right?
Why do you think it started like that, though? The church, okay, we can make some money off of this, you know, because you have to proclaim the banns, they charge you for that, you rent the church for the wedding, or
Right.
all these cohabitations. Well, we lived together for 15 years and now he died, and who gets the house?
Exactly.
ABC, but all of the above?
On a little bit of a basis, I would say all of the above. If I go back to this quote, you know, Ignatius, you know, it becomes both men and women who marry to form their union with the approval of the bishop, that their marriage may be according to God and not after their own lust. You know, that's kind of worded a little harshly, but I think if you read in between the lines, it's probably the church saying, you know, maybe people are getting married for the wrong reasons, and maybe we ought to try to rein that in a little bit. Like, I'm from Woodside. Woodside, I think, has a rule that says, you know, if you want to get married at Woodside, you have to have wedding counseling there, because they want to make sure that they've told you what they feel you need to know. You know, is that the case, Paul? He got married at Woodside. Okay, fine. And so I see that as being similar. Now, later in history, when things have had a chance to get a little corrupt, I wouldn't be surprised that it was a money grab in many ways. Certainly the license, I think, was a money grab because, well, you do the bands for free, but if you want to give me some money, we can waive it, right? That might have been a corruption thing. But I think what's important, though, is that it was always just a private matter, right up until the Reformation. And culture just understood that if you two lived together and you had kids, then you were married. Therefore, culture just understood that these kids were the heir of this estate, etc. And that was just kind of the way it went. Oh, by the way, just the verbal declaration that made a person marriage. Do you want to get married? Yes, I do. Okay. That verbal I do is probably where we get our own I do's from that we still have in our own society. So throughout this period, you can see emerging some of our wedding norms, our wedding ceremony familiar norms. There you go. I don't even know where that one's from.
That was the old-time slavery.
Okay. Now, it was, and interestingly enough, I did not know this until I started researching this presentation, but shockingly, I consider it a little shocking. It was actually the Reformation that actually started to get government involved in marriages. When the Reformation happened, and I think this is largely because the reformers were so eager to repudiate, for example, Catholic sacramental theology, that they pushed marriage off of the church entirely, maybe. Here's a quote from Martin Luther. Martin Luther views marriage as a worldly thing, the estate of the earthly kingdom, subject to the prince, not the pope. So, of course, the guy with the hammer, right, he's in his Martin Luther action pose. You can recognize that as Martin Luther. This guy over here is John Calvin. And, of course, Henry VIII. He seems to be famous. His portrait's famous. John Calvin and the other theologians of the Swiss Reformation, they viewed marriage as a covenant, right? The Swiss Reformation is famous for its covenant theology. Everything is viewed covenantally. So they viewed marriage as a covenant, which is not unbiblical. And I think Malachi talks about weddings, that marriage is a covenant. But to Calvin, marriage covenants required enforcement, right? So who enforces the marriage covenant? Well, that's enforced by the civil authority. So Calvin, when he's organizing things in Geneva, started to put marriage under the civic magistrate. And in England, as England morphed and changed very slowly over the centuries from a monarchy, a despotic monarchy, into a parliamentarian system, eventually this idea of the Commonwealth occurred, right? The British Commonwealth. Well, commonwealth is defined by the Oxford English Dictionary as pertaining to the public welfare, general good, or advantage. So just like the English government, regulated aspects of the state or culture that it felt was for the public good, welfare, or advantage, the English Reformation viewed marriage as being a public good or general welfare type of a situation. And because of that, the government started to assume some control for the same reasons, right? It's for everybody's betterment, therefore we're going to regulate it. So these various Protestant states, for their own reasons, but it was really the Protestant churches that started to kind of back off of marriage and bring in the government. And of course, we all know how government works, right? As soon as they have a little bit, they start taking more and more. So by I think it was 1753, the Marriage Act, this is an English law. In 1753 is the first time in English history where, in order to be recognized legally, a marriage had to be in a church in front of a clergyman with the wedding bands or a license and all the general trappings. Okay, so 26 years before the Declaration of Independence, that's when you had to get married in the church. That's how long it took that to actually evolve within Western culture. Now what's interesting with that Marriage Act of 1753 is it actually, and maybe Mark has actually something to say, but we were talking earlier and he was saying something about how government really doesn't define marriage. This is a big thing for me in this Marriage Act of 1753. It legalized, okay, you have to have a recognized marriage by doing these things, but it didn't make these things up out of thin air. It basically took all the cultural practices that had been slowly emerging since the medieval era. The banns, the license, church weddings in front of a clergy, 2 witnesses, the verbum, I do. It just took that and said, you have to do that. It just codified culture. It took what culture was already doing and said, okay, you have to follow your culture's norms and avoid your culture's taboos. That's all this Wedding Act really did. But by the 1800s, by 1837 in England and in 1875 in Germany, you could get a civil marriage. You could just go down to the courthouse, cut the church out of it completely, right? So by the 19th century, the church in theory was now almost completely out of the, beginning to completely lose its grip on the wedding business at all. Yeah, I guess we could actually cut that off there. So, that gets us to the 19th century, right? So, that's about all I wanted to say about marriage as kind of a backstory, to sort of fill us in on some history lesson and some anthropology. So hopefully, I've told you enough that we can come back and we can look at these arguments and maybe start to re-examine these and see if we've learned something that helps us put this into a little different light. So, argument number 1 then, marriage has always been between a man and a woman. Legalizing gay marriage would be changing thousands of years of tradition. Well, like I said up front, we know that that's not true just from reading your Bible. So hopefully now we've seen a little more and we realize, well, that really isn't true. And since you can go to Tibet right now and take pictures of a woman with her 2 husbands, then no, that's really not true. So undoubtedly there's something meant by that, but it's not really being clearly stated. Actually, the best I've ever been able to figure out what that phrase actually means is people will be reading their Bible, they'll get to Genesis 2, and they'll say, the man and the woman will become one flesh, right? And you read that and say, okay, well, from the very beginning then, this is what marriage was supposed to be, right? Maybe that's what that phrase is supposed to be. But what is supposed to be and what really has happened are 2 very different things, right? This is a statement about, the ideal marriage has always been a man and a woman, stated as if that's what's actually been happening. It's not what's actually been happening, right? So that's probably not the best argument and the most convincing position to make.
But as early as Genesis 4, Lamech has 2 wives, and by the time you get to Moses and the children of Israel coming out of Egypt, you come to certain portions of the books of Moses in Leviticus 18, and he lists all these sexual sins, and you're scratching your head saying, who does this stuff? But God says, the nations of these lands do all these things and more, and that's part of the reason I'm kicking them out. And so some of these practices that in our minds are abhorrent or we can't imagine anyone did them have been practiced according to the Bible. It doesn't mean it's a practice with God's approval, but again, they have been practiced.
All right, so argument number 2, gay marriage harms, weakens, and undermines the institution of traditional marriage. All right, well, this is one where, for example, we can go back to Greece and China and the Native Americans, and we can say, okay, they had these relationships in their cultures, which they recognized was heterosexual, monogamous marriage as an institution, destroyed, undermined, or whatever in those cultures. And I would suggest that the answer is no, it was not. No, I'm not saying that gay marriage is good, right? I'm not affirming it. Oh, goody goody, gay marriage is fine. You know, we can say that that's good. But I'm saying that it won't lead to a collapse of civilization, right? Because there were places where it was done, and civilization didn't collapse, right? So this argument can be kind of overblown, right? Let's put it this way. Gay marriage has now been legal in this country now for 8 months, something like that. 98% or so of people are still heterosexual, right? And they're gonna wanna get married, and they're gonna wanna do things the old-fashioned way, so that's what's gonna drive culture, right? Gay marriage might have been legal in ancient China, but most Chinese were still heterosexual, so they still followed that culture's heterosexual marriage customs, and Chinese civilization continues on. So it's not a civilization ending thing. The vast number of people are still straight, they still do things their way, that's what drives culture. That's my point. It's not good, but it doesn't lead to systemic collapse like this argument would suggest. Number 3, if we legalize gay marriage, it's a slippery slope to polygamy, incest, and or bestiality, as we will have eliminated our justification to deny these other practices. This is actually, I think, a fair argument, because as we've seen, all these other marriage practices used to exist, and still exist in some places, right? The Mormons today would like to be able to do this. So, yeah, that's a fair argument. I do think bestiality is very much a taboo. I don't think anybody's clamoring for that to be legalized. That might be a little bit of a scare tactic to include that. But, and incest as well. Most societies would view that as negative. Incest and bestiality happen, but I think everywhere they happen, they are viewed as violating taboos, right? But all the other marriage practices we've seen, there's no reason that those couldn't make a comeback if culture wanted to make a comeback. So this is a good argument in that. Number 4, the purpose of marriage is to procreate, and same-sex couples can have children. All right, now this one, I don't know if I really presented the type of information I needed to make this argument. But, because of course this thing started out as a 3-hour speech, right? And I had to keep paring it down. Looking at maybe the Greek guy marrying the boy, what was that marriage? What did that marriage do? That marriage basically made it legal for him to be having sex with the boy. It gained cultural recognition for him to be having this relationship with the boy. In most marriage customs that you're going to find throughout history or culture, it's usually gaining recognition of your relationship with another person. That is primarily what marriage does. It's social recognition of your relationship with another person. And then from that relationship, if children issue, then it also gains legal recognition for those children. Those kids are legally recognized as being your kids because you're married, right? For example, we use the term illegitimate child. Well, what do we mean? We mean a child who's born to 2 people who aren't married. Well, what does illegitimate mean? It means not legally recognized, right? So that's really what it seems to be marriage is for. Legitimizes a sexual relationship and then gives legal status to the children. So this argument is marriage is to procreate. I don't think that's really the case. It's to legitimize the sexual relationship and then gain legal status for resulting children. Number 5, marriage is not the creation of the state, thus the state does not have the power to redefine marriage or create new kinds of marriages. Human sexuality, childbirth, those are not the creation of the state, right? Wedding customs are the creation of culture. Laws requiring you to follow your culture's wedding customs are creations of the state. And it's not really unusual for governments to pass laws that say you have to follow your culture's norms, right? That's what most laws actually are. So that's how I would kind of put a little bit fine tuning on that. Civil unions are just as good as gay marriage. The term gay marriage should be reserved, or I'm sorry, the term marriage should be reserved for what it is, the union of one man and one woman. You can actually say that this is a fair argument because the historic precedent, again, of China, Greece, where they had recognized marriages, those were still not on the level of heterosexual marriages within those cultures, right? They were all temporary or they were considered side things. So in so much as civil union is not at the same status as marriage, that is reasonable to argue. However, what I see a little bit of in this argument as well, civil union argument, is kind of a little bit of, there's a little bit of fear. Oh no, it looks like the gay lobby's gonna win eventually. Maybe we have to head it off by letting them have a lot as long as they give us the word marriage. But they didn't buy that, they just continued on until they got the word marriage too, right? So, I don't know. I probably need to move on to the next stage of the presentation. So I hoped that I said something here that was useful and it wasn't just a deluge of bizarre photographs and unusual gibberish.